Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Americans for Peace Now webinar. I'm Ori Nir. Before we introduce the topic and the speakers, our usual housekeeping notes. You're probably familiar with them by now, but never a problem in reminding people. So this webinar, like all our webinars, is recorded. The video will be posted on our YouTube channel and the audio on our podcast, Peacecast. You are invited, and the second housekeeping note that you're familiar with is that you're invited to ask questions, and you can do that anytime, beginning now, by using the Q&A tool that's at the bottom of your screen. And I do ask you, as usual, to keep your questions really short because I will have to go through them and read them as we go along. This is a special webinar today. We asked two friends to tell us about their joint journey into the national narratives of the two peoples who are in conflict in Israel-Palestine. It's a fascinating journey. I had a chance to read some of their joint writings and to interact with them by email in the past couple of weeks. And I can assure you that it's going to be an interesting conversation. They've already published an article or two, and they're now working on a book and on a podcast that will dig deeper into the national narratives of Israelis and Palestinians and into their reaction or interaction with those narratives. Further, since they're both in the diaspora, they will share with us their thoughts about the role of diaspora Jews and Palestinians, the role that they can play in advancing a mutual understanding and helping to pave the path toward a future Israeli-Palestinian settlement or better relationship, let's call it that way. So the two who are with us are Mira Sucharov, who is a Canadian Jewish political scientist. She specializes in Israeli-Palestinian politics, and Omar Dajani, a Palestinian-American law professor and former legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in peace talks with Israel. You might remember that there's been such a thing. I think it'll be an interesting conversation. Other than the reading of articles that they've written together, as I mentioned, I had a lively correspondence with them, and I also really enjoyed their social media postings. I think I'm looking forward to a really fascinating conversation. So, Mira, Omar, thank you very much for joining us on this APN podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
I'm assuming that a significant portion of our conversation will be in first person. You'll be talking about what your joint experiences did to you, maybe transformations that you've had and so on. So I thought it may be a good idea to start by asking the two of you, each one of you, to tell us about your background, whatever you think is relevant to the discussion that we'll have later. And I'm hoping that this kind of introduction that you'll make, your personal introduction, would help us segue into the inception of the project that you're engaged in, and so on. So maybe Mira, do you want to start?
Certainly. Well, maybe I'll start with how you introduced me, Ori, as a Canadian Jewish political scientist. And I'm thinking back to when I was just starting out in graduate school, very long time ago. I don't think the internet was barely even invented then. And I'm wondering how I would have felt if someone had introduced me as a Canadian Jewish political scientist. And I think I may have bristled a little bit, thinking at the time that any kind of subjective identity should be kept to the side, and that if I'm Jewish, it's incidental perhaps to the kind of scholarly, objective, arm's length work I'm trying to do. And now I feel very, very differently. And I feel that the way we experience the world is a function of so many things, and my Jewish identity is no doubt a huge part of that. And in the context of being Jewish, in the context of the kind of work I do focusing on Israel-Palestine, what's also equally, if not even more important, is the sense of attachment I've had from the time I was a young child to Israel. And that kind of creates a large part of the baseline for the way I approach the work. But in terms of how we got started, for the long time, I was collaborating with other Jewish scholars a lot, or going at it alone. I wrote many pieces in Haaretz, for example, almost all of which were sole authored. And at a certain point, I felt that it was really time to reach out, and really engage deeply and in a complex way, and even in a challenging way, with a Palestinian scholar, a Palestinian-American scholar. So I knocked on Omar's door.
So Omar, before you go to the answering the door, answering the knock, if you could just tell us a little bit about your background, maybe a bit about your family, where you grew up, and so on.
Sure, sure. So it's funny. I very often will introduce myself as a Palestinian-American, but the truth is that I'm only 1/4 Palestinian. If you talk about bloodlines, my father was born in Jaffa and fled in 1968 in the context of the Nakba, and met my mother, who was Syrian and French, in Syria a couple years later, and they immigrated together to the United States, where off and on our family has lived since that time. So I'm Palestinian, Syrian, French. I'm Sunni, Alawi, Roman Catholic. And I think that sometimes those hybrid identities get washed away a little bit when one talks about the set of things that we're going to be discussing today, because the binary looms so large over the topics. So mixed background, because I grew up in East Texas, or maybe in spite of the fact that I grew up in East Texas, I really didn't connect with my Palestinian identity until I went to college. It was something that I was very happy to suppress or ignore, and it presented itself like the first Intifada, or along with the first Intifada, in my first year in college, and it was what pulled me in, and since that time has been not only a really important part of my identity, but also a significant part of my career path. I'll just say two other things as background. The first is that, as you mentioned, I'm trained as a lawyer and spent some years practicing law, and that was my what brought me to Israel-Palestine initially. My first visit there was showing up in 1999 to serve as legal advisor to the PLO in what was a British-funded project. And so my first experiences on the ground there were formed by the experience of being a lawyer in negotiations. I'm also, as you mentioned, an academic, and so a lot of the work that I have done since that time has been academic and policy oriented, and so in a sense, one of the things that's turned out to be so refreshing for me about the work that Mira and I have undertaken together is that whereas we started with some policy conversations, what we have veered into is a set of projects that are more personal in nature, that require us and allow us to connect our identity and our experience to what we're exploring together on the ground. And in some respects, and it feels like exactly what this moment calls for.
Interesting. So you said that it feels like this, what this moment calls for. Maybe let's talk about that, about the nature of the moment and why the moment is significant. Maybe I'll ask Mira to start with that. But before we go there, just to clarify, Omar, you spoke about your father having come from Palestine, born in Palestine, right, in Jaffa. Was his family narrative, as it relates to the national narrative of the Palestinians, present in your growing up at home?
To some extent, yes, but not so much from my father. I learned most of what I know about my family from my extended family, from my father's younger brothers, and during summers spent in Cairo, and so that's where, you know, my family has a long history in Jaffa in particular, and in Palestine. It's a big and old family, and I had no notion of it growing up until arriving in Egypt and being told all about it by my cousin and by my uncle and my cousins.
Good. Okay, so I'm going to ask Mira to talk a little bit about the project, about why the project, and about why now Omar related to the, you know, the timing and how significant it is. So please go ahead.
Sure. I'll talk a bit about the book. Omar will talk about the podcast. The book we're working on is under contract with a trade press, and want to shout out to our wonderful and supportive agent, Andy Ross, in the Bay Area. And the book looks at diaspora communities and at Israeli Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel communities, and looking at the emotions of the place. So we're starting from our own vantage point of how we feel attached or even alienated from Israel-Palestine. We tend to use the hyphenated version, Israel-Palestine. Some people don't like that formulation for various reasons. Some people think that it has to be that it's Israel and of course there's the anti-Palestinian version, which has sort of kind of hateful notions about Palestinians and the lack of their existence. But even from a Palestine solidarity perspective, some would say that Palestine doesn't currently exist as an independent entity, and so don't pretend that it does, because there's a lot of work to be done until that happens. And so that maybe it's a whitewashing of the current oppressive situation. But for now, we like the hyphenated version, and we each have very particular ways of accessing the place and ways of experiencing the place. And so what we wanted to do was, over the course of about 8 chapters, we're looking at different places, and the places range from cities like Jerusalem and Tel Aviv to Jaffa. Even though Jaffa is formally amalgamated to Tel Aviv, there's a very particular family history for Omar there, and it's more of what's called a mixed city, meaning that Palestinian citizens live alongside Israeli Jewish citizens in all the ways you would expect when there are class and ethnic differences, such as urban gentrification, processes that we're investigating as well. Cities like Haifa, another mixed city, and areas near the Gaza Strip. My kibbutz family, which means a family that kind of took me under their wing when I was an overseas student and spent a lot of time on a kibbutz in the northern Negev, they live adjacent to Gaza. So we'll spend some time with them and look at what it's like to live under Hamas fire. We want to go to Gaza, but we're not yet able to. So in the meantime, we both share a wonderful Arabic teacher, though Omar's Arabic is excellent and mine is very still quite rudimentary. We share an Arabic teacher on Zoom who lives in Gaza. So she gives us a bit of an inside feel to what it's like to live there. And we even plan to go to Jordan to visit some of Omar's family there. He's mentioned his Egyptian family. He also has Jordanian family, and look at what the Israel-Palestine predicament looks like from across the Jordan River. So the book is in a narrative form. It's like a joint travel memoir. It's very personal, it's very vulnerable, and it really reveals a lot of our individual and joint challenges.
And it's non-academic. I mean that.
Well, academics don't like to say that it's not, but you're right that it's meant for a general audience, so it's very accessible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So maybe I'll ask you, Omar, why is it important? Why is it important, and why is it important now to engage in such a project?
So I might add just one thing to Mira's description of the book. Part of what we are undertaking to do is to show each other this place that is of incredible importance to each of us. And by gazing upon it together, to try to enable the other to see things that he or she might not otherwise see. We undertook this as we began going to cities in Israel-Palestine. I mean, even I would say months before we started visiting the country, what we realized is that we have very similar values, that we come to these projects, we come to the friendship that we've built with a similar sensibility with regard to a whole range of progressive values writ large, and even with regard to what peace and justice should not look like in Israel-Palestine, and some of what it should look like. But I think that what we were unprepared for was how different our emotional reactions to the place, and at times to each other's reactions to the place would be. And it seemed to us really important to try to understand each other's attachment at an emotional level, to engage in a way that is not all about rational analysis of the kind that each of us has spent a long time doing about the merits and liabilities of a particular way of configuring authority, one state, two states, etc., or a particular response to an issue like refugees or Jerusalem, to move from that kind of analysis to engaging these questions at an emotional level, with a view toward achieving both the different kind of understanding that comes with that, and the different possibilities for persuasion, I think, that comes with that. And I think that on that last point, that's, to my mind, maybe the best answer to the question that you posed. I think we try so hard, not just in relation to Israel-Palestine, but also this deeply polarized other country that we inhabit, or countries that we inhabit in North America. We try so hard to make our case. And I think that sometimes it is stories and the kinds of vulnerabilities that Mira pointed to a moment ago that perhaps win more hearts.
I'd like to just jump in one thing. I wanted to note an omission that I made and really try to let the audience kind of figure out unconsciously why that happened. And I also just wanted to build on something Omar had said. Notice that I talked about cities in Israel proper, and I don't know what the current lingo that Peace Now, Americans for Peace Now, uses to talk about Israel to the west of the Green Line. But notice I said Jerusalem, or at least West Jerusalem, I was thinking of at the moment, Jerusalem, Jaffa, Tel Aviv, Haifa, and then I went right over way east to Amman and Jordan. And I omitted mentioning that we've been to Ramallah and Bethlehem, and we plan to go to Nablus. And so I think that's also part of the struggle, is to think of what is my or our, if I'm speaking on behalf, I'm not really speaking on behalf of, but if I'm thinking about my other diaspora Jewish contemporaries, what is our Israel? Is our Israel the West Bank, or is the West Bank another separate soon-to-be state? Or are we thinking about it in a more integrative way one day, that we'll be able to go, that Israelis can go freely one day to Ramallah and grab a backgammon game with the guys that I met when I wandered into a cafe one morning, and my Arabic wasn't good at all yet. So fortunately, one of the Palestinian players had gone to medical school in Morocco. So we managed with my Canadian French and his Moroccan French, or go to Bethlehem and go to the bar that we spent an evening at, Omar and I, where we took an impromptu salsa dancing workshop that we weren't expecting to find at a bar in Bethlehem. So in other words, what is our version of Israel-Palestine? So that's one thing we're going to look at. And I'm really struggling, or just kind of curious about how I omitted those towns, which were some of the best food we've had. And food is, the sensory experience is one of the most certainly memorable and fun parts of our adventures.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say is we've had a chance to practice some of these, the idea of showing each other spaces in places that are less loaded, and then we've been able to scale up from that. So we've spent time walking the streets of San Francisco, Omar's home city, as well as Ottawa, my home city, as well as Montreal, which is where I went to undergrad at McGill and got started on Middle East studies. So we were able to see what it looks like to share each other's homes in ways that are, again, much less loaded at the same time, and at the risk of maybe some people will think this is virtue signaling, but I think it's something we both care a lot about and are thinking a lot about all the time, is what does it mean to live as non-Indigenous peoples in the cities that we live in and that we travel within North America, because in some sense we're both visitors. Omar's parents came a generation later than my family, but none of us are Indigenous, and we owe a lot of our existence to this place, to them in this place on Turtle Island.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
If I may, I might just tell a little bit about the podcast as a compliment, just to get that on the table. Yeah, go ahead.
So, I'm looking at questions that people are asking questions, which is great. And there are already 3 questions about the book. Is the book out? When is it going to be out? So if you could just say a few words about that too, that'll be great.
Sure. So no, the book is not out. In fact, it's only a small part of it is written. So it'll be coming. We aim to complete it by December 24. And so you can expect it. Prometheus Books will be publishing it, which is a division of Rowman and Littlefield, in 2025. So there's a little lag there, and a period ahead that throws a lot of questions into the mix. But just to add one more thing to the mix. So in addition to working on this book project together, we're also working on what could be called a podcast or an audio documentary. The working title of it is The Vacant Lot. And what we undertake to do in the podcast is over the course of a number of episodes to tell the story of Jaffa, and of Israel-Palestine more broadly by doing a micro-history of the piece of land in the Ajami district of Jaffa, on which my family's house once stood. And so the podcast will look backwards at the place that Jaffa was and that this neighborhood was. It'll tell the history, which I think is unknown to many people. Indeed, much of it was a surprise to me, of what happened in Jaffa in 1948 and 49. It'll explore then what's happened in Jaffa since that time, the transformation of the town, the in-migration of Jewish refugees from places like Bulgaria and Morocco and Iraq. Some of those refugees lived in Palestinian homes with Palestinians, which is a really complicated and interesting story in itself. And the question that we'll be asking is, what should be done with this piece of land, and who should have a say in it? Now, it sits overlooking the sea in one of the most rapidly gentrifying parts in all of Israel. And so as we've been talking to a lot of different people, as we've worked on our book, we've also been posing the question, what should be the fate? What should be built there? And we've been engaging with folks in the municipality, with city planners, with city council members, as well as with activists and human rights advocates. And so we've gotten a lot of different answers. The last thing I'll say is that, Mira spoke poignantly a minute ago about, the significance of what we remember and what we omit when we're discussing things. And part of the reason why it seemed important to us to do this podcast is that the story of places like Jaffa is so often omitted. indeed the story of 1948, and it's the ways in which it continues to loom large over the way in which Israelis and Palestinians relate to each other, and over our efforts to try to chart a path toward a better future, in view that we felt like excavating and imagining together seemed like important things to do.
So yeah, as Mira mentioned earlier, and as you alluded to, Omar, as well, you went on a journey, embarked on a journey together that was really paved with empathy, an open heart, an open mind. It reminded me of the journey that I went on when I was a reporter and started as as a rookie, basically reporting on Palestinians, and was encouraged by my editors at the time to really empathize and try to give their voice over the pages of the Haaretz newspaper at the time. What I would be interested in hearing from you is some examples of the insights that you've experienced along the way. Maybe I don't know, blind spots that you had in terms of understanding the other side, and the types of things that you believe Jews and Palestinians should know about each other to advance toward a better future.
I can start there because I feel I have the more embarrassing blind spots. So I'm a little embarrassed that I didn't think about this, but let me start with this. For my whole life, from as long as starting from age 6, I've known Hebrew very well. And I remember it was age 6 because our Hebrew teacher in my Jewish day school in Winnipeg, Manitoba, wanted to teach us how to tell her when we were finished our homework or when we were finished a class assignment. And Hebrew teachers, particularly at that time, always went by their first names. Her name was Anat, and she wanted us to repeat after her, Anat Gamalti. Anat, I'm finished. And I remember thinking, oh, Gamalti must be her middle name. So it took a while till I understood that it was the verb for I've finished. And so I've loved Hebrew forever. I went to the last remaining Hebrew immersion summer camp in North America. A lot of this is detailed in my memoir, which I can tell you about later. And so when it was time for me to get a tattoo, I say that as if every middle-aged mother one day needs a tattoo. But after my second child's bar mitzvah, I decided it's time. And so it's just felt totally natural for me to get my children's Hebrew names written on my tattoo. And so one of them is the name they go by anyway, and the other one is a translation of their English name, or a rough translation. And I thought about what I wanted as a tattoo, and I thought if there's words, maybe a threatening man one day on the sidewalk in Ottawa will try to engage me and ask what it says, and maybe I won't want to reveal my children's names. So I had all these nervous thoughts in my head, all about the privacy of my children and a strange man, proverbial strange man on the streets of Ottawa. Never did it occur to me that when I'm around Palestinians, they might interpret my tattoo in a threatening manner, thinking, not knowing where I'm coming from, and relating to Hebrew, which is for me a cherished marker of my identity, as a language of oppression or as a symbol of oppression for them. It never occurred to me. So fast forward to Omar and I being in Jaffa at a cafe interviewing a member of Knesset. Now remember that Palestinian, for those who maybe aren't familiar in the audience, Palestinian citizens of Israel, of course, speak Arabic perfectly and speak Hebrew perfectly. So even though I consider myself fluent in Hebrew, on average, every Palestinian citizen of Israel, particularly anyone who has high school education or especially university, will have better Hebrew than me. So as we're interviewing this member of Knesset in English, because that was the language that was most common for the three of us, I start intervening with some Hebrew phrases, trying to create a little common ground, and knowing that the interlocutor, the interviewee's Hebrew is better than mine. And so there would be no concern that he would think that I'm lording over some linguistic prowess over him. And Omar whispers to me later, not whispers because we're out of earshot later, says, can I give you some unsolicited advice? And whenever Omar offers any sort of advice, solicited or unsolicited, I listen eagerly. And he says, if you want to make a connection or forge some sort of intimate moment with a Palestinian citizen of Israel, speaking Hebrew to them is not the way to do it. So the tears fall, the white fragility happens. I'm, hurting, thinking the language I cherish so much and is probably one of the most important aspects of my connection to Israel, because it's certainly not religion, it's certainly not holy stones and places where I feel that religion has taken over, but where it's language and culture, where that is now being seen as a weapon or as something hurtful, was hard for me. And so since then that motivated me to actually take my 2 years of literary Arabic that I'd studied many years ago, which isn't very useful. That really motivated me to go headfirst into multiple hours of Arabic a week with my current teacher in Gaza.
And by the way, we have a question in the Q&A. Someone wants you to refer them to your teacher in Gaza. So I'm going to do that offline. I'll just we'll do it later. But awesome. I have to say, Mira, I so empathize with the experience that you're going through in terms of language and language as a tool. I'll just say in just a really quick sentence in passing, when I started covering Palestinian affairs, I came in with excellent literary Arabic. I could speak with tanween at the end and so on. But my spoken Arabic was terrible. And what I found was that people were really impressed and heartened by the fact that I made a real effort to try to communicate with them in their language, although many Palestinians in the West Bank too speak fluent Hebrew and English, of course, as well. Omar?
It's been a constant learning experience. I guess I would say two things. So at one level, what's been really valuable is the process of learning about getting a sense of the phrases, the expressions that end up being triggers for each of us. Again, starting from similar values, but just not realizing what will set you off. At one point, I wrote in something that we were co-authoring, but that had a first-person dimension. Some of my best friends are Jewish. And Mira said, "Oh, that says all of the wrong things to a Jewish ear." And I said, "But it happens to be true. I mean, isn't that a significant piece of the story that people who were dear to me at college and law school and subsequently are Jewish?" And so unpacking those things, getting a sense of why they set us off, I think, is important. But the other thing that occurs to me is that I think before going to Israel-Palestine, there was not much that felt conflictual between us. In fact, we joked with each other when we were writing our book proposal, saying like, we're going to have to drum up conflict, find something to create a little tension so that the book is a bit more engaging. When we got there, we realized that we didn't need to drum up tension, that place did it for us. And I think it wasn't so much, again, that our sense of how particular questions should be resolved or whether something that we encountered was just or unjust. It wasn't that we had differences about those sorts of things. It was that our experience being there was so different. Everywhere I look when I'm there, I feel injustice. It feels toxic, unless I'm, in Ramallah having a vigile, and in a space that just feels light. But in mixed spaces, I tense up, and I will tend to see the darkness in much of what I see around me. Mira is able, of course, also to see that darkness, but also sees this place that she loves. And so part of what we have had to work through together is how to honor each other's attachment and love for the place, for people, for language, to not take it personally, to understand at the end of the day that it's not all about each of us. And that's a hard thing, especially if, speaking from my perspective, though I think a version of this is something that Jews can also relate to. If you feel very often silenced, if you feel that the prevailing discourse is one that doesn't give your narrative space, then you constantly want to carve that out. And for me to sort of relax a bit, to let Mira show me the things she loves without me immediately saying, but that felt like an important thing and something that I think we still struggle through.
Can I just jump in here, Ori? You knew
Sure,
I would.
yeah.
So one example of Omar trying really hard to do that, but I know him too well to know, like, he can't totally fake it. And we take a lot of pictures while we're there. We're going to use them for the book. We're going to use them for our social media. We use them for our own memories. There was one photograph I had to delete because it was too upsetting to look at. And for me to delete a photo of Omar, that's like not common because he's very photogenic, but I could see he was faking it. And that was after we had a very moving and sobering interview with a young Palestinian city council member of the Jaffa Tel Aviv municipality, and he was Jaffa based, and we were in Jaffa. And then we immediately, because we looked at our schedule that we had created for ourselves, next up, Sabich in Dizengoff Circle at Frischmann Sabich. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Sabich is probably the one maybe non-culturally appropriate food, but we could discuss that. It's the one food invention by Israel. I think it was started out in Ramat Gan in a suburb of Tel Aviv by
Yep, you're right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And it is fried eggplant, hard-boiled egg, vegetables, and pita and with tahina. So I took him for Sabich, one of the most storied places, and we went and we had it. We sat, we ordered it, we ate it, we sat next to the fountain in the refurbished Dizengoff Square, which is really a circle, which is very lovely. And I could just see Omar was in emotional pain. The whiplash of coming from that interview with all the socioeconomic, political oppression and distress going on in particularly the Palestinian community that particular city council person represents. And then coming to Tel Aviv and with all the high-tech wealth, and that's a very privileged part of the country. Of course, not all Israelis live like they do in the ones who are with their shorts and flip-flops in Dizengoff Center. So I don't want to flatten all of Israel's own domestic citizens who are under socioeconomic distress themselves. And it was too much. And though he had a lovely smile, I had to delete the photo. It was painful for me because I felt, we can unpack this more, but I think you get the idea. I think that's what I wanted to say, but I think there was more that I've forgotten.
I'm looking at the questions that we're getting, and I'm also looking at the clock. I mean, this is time is passing really quickly this time around. There are two themes that I would really love for you to really dig deep into. One, and that's a question that I see has come up by several of our attendees, has to do with the question of the role of the diaspora. Someone is asking here, what can people in the diaspora do to ameliorate the conflict, and so on. So maybe talk about that first, and then I'll go to the other theme. Yeah.
I guess I do have a thought on that, and it really is about my own personal journey as a diaspora Jew attached to Israel for many years. And I think it has to do with two words. One word that we try not to use a whole lot. I don't think we use the word Zionism a lot in our book, do we, Omar? We'll see. We will unpack it at some point, but I think we try to leave some of the labels to the side because we're trying to get at the issues. But I think Zionism itself and Palestinian refugees, I think those are the two biggest issues. Speaking for what diaspora Jews can do. Maybe I'll let Omar speak to the diaspora Palestinian experience as best he can. So I think diaspora Jews, and I would include myself in this until very recently, had long bracketed the refugee experience as saying, well, that they'll just have to suck it up. Palestinians will just have to accept not returning. They will just have to accept that any state they create will probably be in, like many progressive diaspora Jews were very content embracing a two-state solution. We're very content saying, sure, there should be a Palestinian state in Ramallah and Jericho and Bethlehem and Nablus, but leave our Israel to us. Sure, there might be some Palestinian citizens of Israel. We can handle that. Let's hope they don't. Let's hope their birth rates don't go up too much. We'll handle them as a minority. Remember, words that sound very natural in a Zionist discourse can sound very hurtful to Palestinians who don't think of themselves as a minority. They were there before the state of Israel was created, of course. So thinking about forcing Palestinians to bracket the refugee issue as if that is an inconvenience to Jewish diaspora sensibilities. That's one thing I've learned not to do anymore. And I got to that place a few years before I knocked on Omar's proverbial door. And thinking about Zionism, thinking about how the term Zionism is used and understood very differently across different audiences. And so if a diaspora Jew goes to college or university and arrives on campus and just casually says and is going out for drinks with some Palestinian students and casually says, by the way, I'm a Zionist, you have to realize what that will sound like, because to a Palestinian ear, it will sound like Jewish oppression formalized in a governance structure. It will sound like you believe that Jews should have more rights than non-Jews in Israel among citizens. And it will sound like you're saying, suck it up to refugees and you're never going to have a chance to return home because we need a Jewish majority state. Now, for those who feel that, of course, Jews need a Jewish majority state because of the history of anti-Semitism and persecution, that's where there are more creative solutions being discussed, and Omar's on the forefront of these, and we can talk about that perhaps at a subsequent webinar. Things like confederation, and maybe Peace Now, American APN has had a webinar devoted to that or may yet. So there are creative solutions that can split the difference. But before even getting to the point of what kinds of political arrangements there should be, and it is something we are and have and will continue to give a lot of thought to, you have to realize the assumptions that mainstream diaspora communities make feel and sound very different to Palestinians.
Mira, can I push you to just say a few sentences about the poll that you conducted and the different ways that Zionism is, the word Zionism is understood, even though it's not about our joint projects. I just feel like it's a really important insight.
Sure, thanks. Last year I ran, I guess it was a year and a half ago, I ran a poll, a survey among American Jews, and I published a brief version of the results in Haaretz. You can look up that article after for anyone who's interested. And when I asked American Jews, are you a Zionist, without any particular definition, a solid majority said they were, I think 58%. And then when I said, I'm going to pose a couple of different definitions, tell me if you're still a Zionist. Zionism means an attachment to Israel. 70% said they feel like a Zionist. Zionism means a belief in a Jewish and democratic state. 70% said they were Zionists. And then I posed another definition, and I didn't say anything more about it except for what follows. But in my mind, it was the definition that I understand Palestinians to hold when they think about Zionism. And it is as follows. Zionism is the belief in a governance structure in Israel that privileges Jews over non-Jews. Only 10% of American Jews in my survey said they were Zionists, according to that definition. So in a sense, that does give me some hope that there can be a better discourse across communities when we start to understand how terms are used and understood across difference.
It's really interesting. What I'm hearing from both of you is that one of the advantages that people in the diaspora have, and I'm talking particularly about North America here, is that there is more of a chance to agree on a common denominator of values, on an ethical common denominator upon which the conversation will take place, which I think is really interesting. It's something that both of you mentioned during the conversation. I would point out one more thing, which is maybe more prosaic, and that is the chance to have a conversation. As strange as it may sound to people here, because we're thinking about the proximity of Jews and Arabs in Jews and Palestinians, or Israelis and Palestinians, whatever we want to call them, in Israel-Palestine. There's a geographic proximity, but there's also a great deal of segregation. I know it sounds like a terrible word, but it actually describes reality, particularly when you're talking about Israelis and Palestinians in the occupied territories. There isn't much of a chance to commingle. Just here in Washington, there's a program that is taking place right now called New Story Leadership, which brings Israeli and Palestinian young leaders or potential leaders to engage in a conversation and a joint experience. It's something that, unfortunately, you cannot have in the region itself. You have to ship them here to Washington.
Except in terms of the West Bank and Israel proper, you're absolutely right. But in terms of Israel itself, you are mostly right, except for one thing that you know about, but I want to let our listeners know, that is a wonderful experiment in the kind of future meeting of the minds that we envision, and that is the half a dozen bilingual schools. In North America, they're called, the charitable organization is called Hand in Hand. In Israel, they call them the bilingual schools, and where roughly half the student population is Jewish Israeli, roughly half is Palestinian citizens of Israel, plus some residents of East Jerusalem. There are two teachers at the front of the room, not doing simultaneous translation UN style, but doing a sort of simultaneous dance, or not an intertwined dance of Hebrew and Arabic. Students learn both languages proficiently, and most importantly, learn both national narratives, celebrate all holidays, think about what 1948 means for each collective group, and make social connections. Now, of course, when they reach high school and as the age of army recruitment approaches, tensions result. I've written about this also in Haaretz when I interviewed some alumni. So it's not all roses, but if it were, then we wouldn't be in the situation we're in.
It's a pity that it's not a much more common phenomenon. We're hoping that there'll be many more of these schools and students trained in them. Sorry, Ori, you were about to say.
No, that's perfectly fine. Mira, if you may, just with a quick reaction to this. There's someone asking a question. Interestingly, that person has the same family name as yours, and the comment is Mira's 70 versus 10% of Zionism suggests that 60% of American Jews disavow or are unconscious of the oppressive nature of Zionism. Do you agree with that statement?
I very much agree, because the person asking the question is most likely my dad. And he and my mom sent me to the same Hebrew camp that he went to for a decade, and to the same Jewish day school that he went to for a decade, including having the same 5th grade teacher. And I think if he realized the extent to which we were both at two different generations indoctrinated into an invisibility of the Palestinian experience, a denial of the effect that Zionism has had on Palestinians, I don't know if he would have not sent me there, but I think we would have had a lot more tough conversations earlier in my life than later, when he and I both independently and then together started exploring a broader historical record. And then once I got very engaged in Israel-Palestine, the place.
Good. So the other theme that I wanted to touch upon, and we really have quite a few questions on that, has to do with the relationship between the political and the personal. And someone brought up the really interesting insight that you started with the political and then went into the personal in order to get a better understanding, perhaps, of the political. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then there's a more specific question. It's specific, but it relates to something that is huge. If we leave aside for a moment the political nature of the solution, if there is a solution at the end, 2 states, confederation, whatever it would be, what kind of a relationship do you view as an optimal perhaps optimal relationship between the two communities, the two peoples in the future. What would be the underpinnings of this kind of relationship?
Big questions.
Yeah.
Well, I spoke a bit about
It looks like you have a ready answer. I've got some thoughts, but you go ahead.
Or that I just want to make sure that you didn't have a chance to answer the earlier question, and I think this is a good chance for you to do that. And that I spoke about what diaspora Jewish communities need to understand better, and so maybe this is a good chance for you to roll that question and this one into one and talk about the Palestinian community as you experience it.
Thanks, Mira. Yep.
In the diaspora, right? That's what we're talking about right now.
Yeah. Thank you. There are a few things, and I'm not sure that they're easy to disentangle, but I will try. So the first thing that I wanted to mention is that one of the things that Mira and I have had to navigate is the responses of our respective communities to our projects, to even our friendship at certain junctures. And we recognize that in some ways it's an analog to the experience of negotiators, as I experienced it many years ago, where you're negotiating with the person in front of you. You build a certain closeness, and in that closeness, you become remote from the community that you came from, and that maybe you're representing. And so there's this second negotiation that has to occur. And each of us has experienced that. Each of us has grappled with folks who were ambivalent or even hostile to our projects, or to what we were to one of the other of us. And so, in the Palestinian context, one of the things that I've struggled a lot with is how to think about the roles of BDS and anti-normalization in relation to the projects that we're undertaking. And I'll say off the bat that I'm a supporter of BDS. I believe that there is an important that it's crucial to in a nonviolent way exert pressure to raise the costs of the status quo, because it's difficult for me to see a transformation occurring otherwise. And so Mira has a more complicated position, which I will leave it to her to articulate on that. But with respect to the much more broadly defined concept of anti-normalization, I have myself much more ambivalent feelings, because I think that it forecloses something that is crucial to what we're doing. I think that whereas boycotting businesses or institutions can make a certain sense, particularly in certain contexts, and maybe much less so in others, especially academic contexts, I struggle with it a bit. But I worry about a situation in which separation is deepened by these kinds of strategies, in which the opportunity to actually talk, to engage, to argue, and to empathize becomes more and more difficult. And I think that one of the things that this process has made me feel is all the more imperative is for the Palestinian diaspora community to have a sober conversation about the extent to which these strategies are leading in the directions we want them to. Again, like for me, I can see a lot of value to BDS, but I think that the extent to which anti-normalization is moving in toxic directions makes me much more concerned about it.
And Omar, if you may just,
yeah, please.
I'm sure that our audience is familiar with BDS, but just a word about anti-normalization, just to tell people who don't know what it is. Yeah.
So anti-normalization starts from what, to my mind, is a really sensible proposition, which is that it is problematic to engage in activities that normalize the occupation, meaning that suggest that a situation that is profoundly abnormal, military occupation, denial of self-determination, dispossession, etc., is normal. And there are a range of contexts in which, when this first started, it was applied to. So, suggesting that participating in panels in which one is the token Palestinian in a panel on a topic that has nothing to do with the occupation, nothing to do with politics, as a way of, in a sense, suggesting that Israel is this diverse place that embraces all of its citizens equally. That, I think, is what people rightfully raised concerns about at the outset. What it's become in the years since is a means through which many Palestinians are discouraged from engaging in discourse with folks who either are Israeli or come from a perspective that is not halal with respect to a number of particular issues. It's become a means through which some of our, to my mind, most important voices have been discouraged from engaging in debate with Israelis and with Zionists, and all under the guise that even engaging in the conversation somehow legitimates the positions of the other side. And that's something that I disagree with emphatically.
The hindrance of the communications.
Right.
Yeah. Mira, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I think I'm good, but there might be a couple of threads to just pick up right at the end. But I guess I wanted to say one more thing that I've been thinking about is that our different forms of privilege and power. And so while in a sense, because I'm in our book and our podcast, I'm a proxy, let's say, for the Israeli Jewish experience, and Omar's, let's say, a proxy for the well, I'm not Israeli, whereas Omar, so I guess, how can I say it? I guess I'm a proxy for the Israeli Jewish experience, and I'm a member of the Jewish diaspora community, and by extension, the Jewish nation. Omar is a member of the Palestinian diaspora and the Palestinian refugee people. In a sense, I represent the powerful. I represent the side of the group that has state apparatus behind it. Again, even though I'm not an Israeli citizen, important to note. But there are other ways that our privilege is very complex and complicated. Omar's a man, I'm a woman. Omar's from a very storied Palestinian family. When he walks the streets and introduces himself to Palestinians at a bakery, at a shop, they say, "Welcome home," and they know who his family is exactly. And they know particular members of his family who remained, who were able to stay. And I come from a peasant family in Ukraine and Poland. So there's various forms of privilege that we're attentive to and that we're constantly negotiating. And last point, just about the friends and the family members, sometimes I feel a little resentful, almost like I've had to pay a greater cost because, for example, when one of my relatives who is Israeli and who has made her life in Israel and who shares 25% of my DNA, learned about our projects, she said she no longer wants to see me, even though we travel there even more frequently. And I would love to meet with her, either alone or especially introduce her to Omar, but even alone, she will no longer see me. And that's been very, very painful. So sometimes I turn to Omar and I say, well, what costs have you borne? But Omar has perhaps more subtle costs because I'm sort of represent the position of power. Does that mean he's sort of selling out? And then when some of his friends have reacted suspiciously, perhaps, to our collaboration, I've had to shift my own approach from collapsing in crumpling and say, well, why don't they like me? And it's not about whether they like me or not like me. It's not about that. And I've had to realize, well, if I'm diving headlong into this complicated personal, interpersonal, interpolitical, project, then of course there's going to be these elements of pushback, and so I can't sort of have my cake and eat it too. So that would be my advice to others who are perhaps nervous or squeamish about doing this kind of work. It's hard, but ultimately it's worth it.
Mm-hmm. I want to end, and we should be ending soon, so this will be really, really short. This question, although I know that it can elicit longer answers. I want each one of you to think a little bit, both as scholars and as people who've gone through this path now recently, about one thing. Let's say, okay, so one book that you would advise our participants to read, and one attitude maybe is the right word, or approach that people should adopt if they want to more proficiently swim in this pool. I wanted to use a different word, but I won't say swamp, uh, in this pool of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship conflict.
Wait, the first was a book, and the
A
second?
book, and the second is, if you, I'm looking for some kind of an insight. You shared a few insights in the article that you published in Haaretz about the museums. Some approach, some attitude, some thought that people should have, an insight that would be that would shed a better light on their path as they go forward. I'll tell you, for me, for experience, for example, the role, and I was truly ignorant of that when I first started in my early 20s. The role of the Nakba, the role of 1948 as a formative experience in the life of Palestinians, even in the life of Palestinians who are grandchildren of people who experienced the Nakba. So I'm just wondering what kind of things you have noticed that you would come up with.
You've asked two academics to come up with one book.
Yeah. Yes, one book. I have two that I always recommend to people, but I'm wondering, what you would recommend.
I think I would recommend, well, because I'm sort of the proxy for the diaspora Jewish experience, I'd like to recommend A Palestinian Voice. If people were interested in understanding the diaspora Jewish experience or the Israeli Jewish narrative, I could certainly recommend many. But since many of your audience, I think, might not know this book, Palestinian Walks by Raja Shahada, who has many books to his name, and he's a Ramallah-based lawyer, scholar, and one of the founders, or if not the founder, of the NGO Al-Haq. And this is a lovely book that gets at the experience of occupation through a very sensitive and textured mode of his daily walks through the land and landscape around Ramallah, where he lives, following his expulsion from his family's expulsion from Jaffa in 1948 in the Nakba.
Great. And if you want to share maybe one insight, really in a nutshell, that you have encountered that you would recommend that people be aware of.
Come back to me for that, because I want Omar to come up with his book sooner.
Okay. So yeah, go ahead, Omar.
So I will mirror Mira and suggest a book by a Jewish writer, and but I will do something unorthodox, which is to recommend a book that hasn't yet been published, not ours, alas, but you can find first piece of it in New York Review of Books, which is Nathan Thrall's forthcoming book, A Day in the Life of Abed Salama. The piece in the New York Review will give you a glimpse of the vividness with which, through the story of one person's experience, Thrall, I think, really captures the tragedy that Palestinians have suffered and the broader tragedy of Israel-Palestine, and does it with, to my mind, an incredible sense of empathy and vividness. I think that it has the potential to do the emotional work that we were talking about earlier really well. In terms of the second question, and then I'll give Mira the last word. I think that this may be obvious or trite, so apologies if it is. At the end of the day, I think that it is useful for me to remember that neither of us peoples who make such claims on this place, and actually it's not just us, of course, I can't think of any place where more different people make claims on of different kinds, but neither of us is going anywhere, and we have to learn to honor each other in that space. And so there is a phase that we are in right now of needing to come to terms with our past and chart a future, and dealing with the oppressive situation on the ground sometimes makes it difficult to see. But at the end of the day, if we are going to live with each other, we have to know each other. And so it strikes me as crucially important that we get to know each other like the roommates that we are and will remain.
And I think it's not so much an insight, maybe well, it is an insight. Okay, then I would say is that not only does everyone deserve individual rights, but I think in Israel-Palestine, there is an important place for recognizing both sets of collective rights, which means both sets of peoples needing and deserving and desiring to have their cultures nurtured. So I've spoken a lot about Hebrew language and culture, Arabic language and culture. And so I want to see equality and justice in the place, but I don't want to see a flattening and I don't want to see everyone go through a meat grinder. Excuse the violent imagery, but I guess I've been watching a lot of Scorsese movies lately, but or maybe Tarantino, but I just want to see both peoples feel that they can go through the world with their collective national identities intact and nurtured. And so to that end, which is part of the way that Omar and I met, is I had created a little organization called Drachim, Paths Forward, that elevates this, or that advances this idea of two peoples needing justice, deserving justice and equality, and with two peoples' cultures being nurtured in the land of Israel-Palestine.
Mira, Omar, thank you very, very much. I dropped links in the chat to the two books that you referred to. One of them is not yet published, but there's already a link to it in Amazon. So if people have questions about other things that were raised today, I know that there are a few such references in the QA. Please write to me, and I will either, and I'll answer the questions. We usually don't do that. We usually end right on time, but since the conversation was so fascinating, and I can see that also from the attendance and the questions asked, I want to thank you both on my behalf and on behalf of all the people who've joined us for the webinar today. Good luck with the book, with the webinar, with the podcast, and with everything else that you're going to be doing.
Thank you so much, Ori.
Thanks so much.
Thank you
for having us.
Okay, and thanks for everyone who participated. Bye-bye.